Hello all, I am Mackenzie Harper, President of the Wharton Club of the National Capital Region. It is my pleasure to join you today. Climate change is the greatest challenge of our time. Today, we join together in conversation to emerge stronger in climate change adaptation, migration, restoration, and investment in the future. Thank you to Dr. Sumitra Das, the team at the Wharton Risk Center, Helen, Zoe, and Carol, the Wharton Club of the National Capital Region, our fellow supporting and co-hosting clubs, and all of our speakers today for contributing to this important event. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Catherine Klein, Vice Dean of the Social Impact Initiative and Professor of Management at the Wharton School, to give our opening remarks. Dr. Klein has been at the Wharton School for 17 years. At a time more important than ever, Dr. Klein shapes the vision and strategy for social impact partnerships, initiatives, research, and faculty engagement, and teaches on leadership, organizational change, social impact, and research methods. Dr. Klein, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mackenzie, and thank you to all of you who were here. It is such an important time, as Mackenzie said, and as we all recognize, climate change is the crisis of our time. It is the challenge of our time. We are seeing the impact of climate change in our communities and around the world. We don't need scientists to tell us this is coming. It is here. We see this in increasing extreme weather events, heat waves, droughts, torrential rains and hurricanes, intensifying forest fires, rising sea levels, declining crop yields, flooding, and damage to infrastructure. The poorest individuals, communities, and countries are being hit hardest and will be hit hardest in the future by these trends, but none of us, none of our businesses, none of our communities will be spared. Indeed, if we stay on this current track, global economic output over the next 30 years will be 11 to 14% lower than it would otherwise be. So this is a tremendous challenge, and it is a time for leaders in science, in business, in finance, in education to step up. And it's why I'm so glad that all of you are here today joining together in these important conversations. This is, an area where we have a tremendous obligation at Wharton and in, around the world. Those of us who are lucky enough to have positions of influence in government, in business, in education, in science. And I'm so glad that all of you are coming together for this extraordinary lineup. These issues are tremendously important for Wharton students, for our alumni, for our faculty, and your involvement here and the conversations that will unfold and presentations over the next 4 days will fuel all of our work. So big thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to the Wharton Club of the National Capital Region for organizing this important conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. Now we welcome our first keynote speaker, Christine Harada. Christine is the Executive Director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Council and former Chief Sustainability Officer for the Obama administration. Spanning 20 years of work, Christine's accomplishments speak for themselves. Welcome, Christine.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me, and thank you, everybody, for gathering with us today. It's certainly wonderful to be here among my Wharton friends. So as folks have already stated earlier, the scientific evidence on climate change has grown increasingly stark. Continued warming further destabilize our climate, and will produce more frequent and intense storms and wildfires and heat waves, as well as more damaging droughts and more extensive ecosystem losses. And it's certainly something, I'm based in the Los Angeles area, and it's certainly something that I face on a very real basis, definitely for more and more months per year, right? We have a go bag, we've got a wildfire plan, in addition to the earthquake plan, of course, but that is something that is much more front and center in our lives. And this year alone, extreme weather has upended the US economy and affected 1 in 3 Americans. Wildfires have burned nearly 6 million acres of land, which is equivalent to the total land mass of Massachusetts and Rhode Island combined, and it's destabilized international supply chains. After carving its destructive path through the Gulf of Mexico and stalling commodity exports to the world, Hurricane Ida took down the New York City subway system for hours and dumped a record 3.15 inches of rain in a single hour and brought commerce in the most populous city in the United States to a complete halt. On the other side of the country, closer to where I live, the Hoover Dam's Lake Mead reached its lowest level since the dam was built in 1931 and caused the government to declare the first ever water shortage on the Colorado River and prompted water cutbacks for regional farmers and economies that they support. And as this year draws to a close, the total damage of extreme weather will build upon the $99 billion already incurred by American taxpayers in 2020. And that is why the Biden administration has adopted a whole of government approach for addressing climate change. And we certainly don't view this as mere talk. These are actual actions and steps that we are taking. The climate crisis is at the center of the United States foreign policy and national security, and of course, also on the domestic front. We are strengthening our clean air and water protections. We are holding polluters more accountable for their actions. We are delivering environmental justice in communities all across America. And the federal government is driving assessment, disclosure, and mitigation of climate pollution and climate-related risks to make our nation more resilient in the face of this threat. And together, we're combating the climate crisis with this bold progressive action that combines the full capacity of the federal government with efforts from every corner of our nation, every level of government, and every sector of our economy. It is the policy of the Biden administration to organize and deploy the full capacity of its agencies to combat the climate crisis, to implement a government-wide approach that reduces climate pollution in every sector of the economy, and that it also increases resilience to the impacts of climate change and protects public health, that it also conserves our lands, waters, and biodiversity, delivers on the environmental justice commitments that we made during the campaign, and additionally, spurs very well-paying union jobs and economic growth, especially through innovation, commercialization, and deployment of clean energy technologies and infrastructure. The National Climate Task Force, which was established by President Biden the first week of the administration, of which I am fortunate enough to be a participant, meets on a monthly basis to indeed facilitate the organization and deployment of our government-wide approach to combat the climate crisis. Our agencies are prioritizing action on climate change in our policymaking and budget processes, in contracting and procurement, and in our engagement with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, as well as with workers and communities and leaders across all sectors of our economy. Related to the economy, you may have heard that last week the administration issued a roadmap to build a climate resilient economy to measure, disclose, manage, and mitigate the systemic risks climate change poses to American families, businesses, and our nation overall. This roadmap pushes forward on a broader economic strategy that invests in the country's physical and human infrastructure, reimagines public procurement policy as a tool to strategically shape markets and spread innovation. It also embeds resilience within supply chains critical to the clean energy transition, and leverages the full talent and creativity of all Americans by elevating equity as a top priority in all policy decision-making. And certainly last but not least, as we prepare for it in a couple of weeks' time, it helps to restore the United States' relationship with key allies internationally and finding common ground to meet the global goals of the Paris Agreement. Our strategy lays out a climate risk accountability framework that outlines the core principles for addressing climate-related financial risk, and then provides a roadmap of executive action along 6 lines of work. 1, promoting the resilience of the US financial system to climate-related financial risks. 2nd, to incorporate climate-related financial risk into federal financial management. 3rd, using federal procurement to address climate-related financial risk. 4th, protecting life savings and pensions from climate-related financial risk. 5th, incorporating climate-related financial risk into federal lending and underwriting. And last but not least, building resilient infrastructure in communities. There's a few examples from that recent announcement to help illustrate the extent to which climate is indeed a whole of government effort. So for example, the Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Veterans Affairs, Agriculture, and Treasury are each working to enhance their federal underwriting and lending program standards to better address the climate-related financial risks to their own loan portfolios, while ensuring the safety and security of the communities most impacted by climate change. Also, FEMA began the process of updating its National Flood Insurance Program standards to help communities align their construction and land use practices with the latest data on flood risk reduction. FEMA is gathering stakeholder input to make those communities more resilient and help save lives, and candidly make these revisions to standards that have not been formally updated since 1976. Additionally, NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, released a suite of products to make the federal government's climate information more accessible to Americans. NOAA upgraded its website to make it easier for governments, communities, and businesses to access the data that they need to prepare for and adapt to climate risks. And in the week prior to that, more than 20 agencies released climate adaptation and resilience plans to safeguard federal investments and taxpayer dollars from the costs of climate change. This week, for example, the Department of Labor is announcing that it is proposing a rule that protects workers' hard-earned life savings by making it clear that investment managers can consider climate change and other ESG factors in making investment decisions. Consistent with its statutory mandate, the SEC staff is developing recommendations to the Commission for a mandatory disclosure rule for public issuers that is intended to bring greater clarity to investors about the material risks and opportunities that climate change poses to their investments. Treasury Department's Federal Insurance Office similarly has launched a process to address climate-related risks in the insurance sector, with a focus on assessing the availability and affordability of insurance coverage in high-risk areas for traditionally underserved communities. And that's just on the executive branch front, right? All the agency work. I know that there's a lot of news at the moment with respect to the infrastructure bill, as well as the reconciliation bill currently being negotiated in the House and Senate. And as part of that, you know that there is a $1.2 trillion proposal for an infrastructure investment in our nation. My office handles a lot, or rather coordinates a lot of the permitting associated with building out large, complex, critical infrastructure projects across different sectors, like renewable energy production, conventional energy production, water resources, broadband. This is an all hands on deck challenge. We are all in on this. And as a member of the administration, we are certainly very much committed to ensuring that all of our policies, foreign policy and domestic policies, incorporate climate change. Climate change, of course, though, as you've probably heard the president say, and one that I say as well, it's a challenge that presents tremendous economic opportunities for the US and for the world. It's a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative, it's a moment of peril, but it's also a moment of extraordinary possibilities. And I know that many of you want to be involved in broader climate and sustainability efforts, which requires a step change in how we all think about collective action. How do we pool our resources, our knowledge, our capabilities to tackle climate change together? We need to unleash at least $100 billion in climate-related funding every year, and $3 to $5 trillion per year of investment in private finance, approximately 5 to 8 times higher than current levels. And I'm certainly very grateful for our Wharton colleagues and the other various clubs that are hosting this particular event in providing that leadership and providing a networking forum for us to be able to come together to figure out, no joke, how do we actually address these issues? Because again, it's an economic and a moral imperative, but also one that presents tremendous economic opportunities for all of us. With the pandemic, networking isn't easy. I'm sure that we're all reasonably tired of being on Zooms, endless Zooms at times it might seem, but I urge you to please take the opportunity to meet your fellow alumni. We're a stellar community, and that foundation of trust that was laid back in Walnut Street is absolutely solid. I urge you to please explore ways to innovate, innovative financing models, innovative business models, innovative community partnership models. If Silicon Valley thinks that the disruption caused by digital has been far-reaching, I'd say just wait, because that impact will pale in comparison to the changes coming as we all wrestle with how to transform our businesses and societies to create positive environmental and social impact. And again, I'm certainly very grateful to all of you for your individual leadership and interest in this important fight. There's so many different models out there with respect to climate adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and again, tremendous opportunities for investments. If you take a look at the amount of green investing, for lack of a better way to say it, that has been growing, I think, rather exponentially over the last couple of years. I think the momentum is here. I think that we are just about to start riding that absolutely fantastic wave of opportunities, and certainly look forward to the opportunity to collaborate together. I would also like to urge you to explore models that cross non-traditional sectors. What kinds of business models ensure that we're hitting the triple bottom line of enhancing people, profit, and planet, and making sure that we are all working together in a collaborative manner in doing so. So again, I recognize I probably spoke really quickly, fast and low under the radar as I want to do. But again, I'm very grateful to you all for your individual leadership and your interest in this super important fight. I look forward to the opportunity to work together with you. And thank you again for having me today.
Thank you, Christine. I will now introduce Amanda Lonsdale, fellow board member and CEO of Magnitude Global Finance. Amanda is an expert in promoting sustainable economic development and will introduce the rest of our day.
Thank you, Mackenzie. And welcome to everyone to the first session of the Wharton Climate Conference. As you've noted, today we're focusing on climate adaptation. As Mackenzie noted, I'm Amanda Lonsdale. I'll be your moderator for today. In addition to being a board member of the Wharton Club of the National Capital Region, I'm also CEO of Magnitude Global Finance and a SAIS Wharton graduate. I've spent the past 15 years working in climate change financing and ranging from renewable energy finance to blue infrastructure. I've recently done a fair bit of work on financing for climate adaptation and disaster resilience with the Climate Policy Initiative, whom we'll hear from shortly, and the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. It's an important space and one that doesn't always get the attention that mitigation activities do. So why is adaptation so important? Well, as our speakers noted, all of us are impacted by climate change. A recent study published by Nature Climate Change estimated that 85% of the global population is currently impacted by climate change. We throw around targets for 2030 or 2050, but climate change is happening now. Ecosystems are shifting and changing. People are running out of water, and disasters are increasing in frequency and severity. All of this means that we will have to adapt and be more resilient. We'll need to look at everything from our behaviors to our infrastructure to counteract these effects. Of course, one of the major challenges is who pays for it. But as Christine noted, that also represents a tremendous opportunity. Currently, the gap between what is being funded and what needs to be funded is in the hundreds of billions annually, as our panelists will show you. The bulk of the funding to date has come from governments and donors, which is not sufficient to bridge the gap. Private capital is needed. And there are opportunities for private capital in the climate adaptation space, but challenging this money is not without its challenges. Our keynote speaker and our panelists today are all at the forefront of these issues, coming up with technical, policy, and financial solutions to advance climate adaptation. They'll help us to better understand the issues around climate adaptation, the opportunities, key trends, and what is and isn't working in this space. I'm excited to hear what they have to say, and I encourage the audience to engage through the Q&A feature, as I see some of you have already started to do. Please type your questions into the Q&A, and we'll take them all when the panel concludes. So our first speaker, who is on, great, is Jay Coe. We were running a little bit ahead of schedule, so wanted to make sure he was here. Is Jay Coe. Jay Coe is co-founder and managing director of the Lightsmith Group. He has over 20 years of experience in investing and public policy in the public and private sectors. Prior to founding Lightsmith in 2016, he was the managing director and partner of Sigler Goff, a global alternative investment firm with over $10 billion under management. Prior to joining this firm in 2012, he was the head of investment funds and chief investment strategist at OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, now the DFC, or Development Finance Corporation. In this role, he led the agency's $2.6 billion active emerging markets private equity program. From 2007 to 2009, he led private equity and illiquid investing for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at R3 Capital, formerly the Global Principal Strategies Division of Lehman Brothers. Previously, he focused on direct growth equity investing as a principal at the Carlyle Group, where he worked from 2000 to 2007, and also from 93 to 95. From 98 to 2000, he served as a law clerk, as if he hasn't done enough in investing, also has a law degree, was a law clerk to Justice David Souter of the Supreme Court and to Michael Boudin from the United States Court of Appeals. He serves on the private sector advisory group for the UN Green Climate Fund and the board of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, as well as the advisory committee to the New York Green Bank. He's a founder and chair of the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group, a private sector investor-led initiative that was launched in Paris at COP21, and is an official partner of the UN Secretary General's A2R Climate Resilience Initiative. In addition to all of this, he serves as an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He has an AB magna cum laude from Harvard, a master's degree from Oxford, and a JD from Yale Law School. I think we've established he's quite the expert to be giving us the opening remarks for the climate adaptation piece today. So Jay, with that, I thank you again for being with us, and I will hand it over to you for your remarks.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to everyone that's joining us today for this important discussion on adaptation and climate resilience investment. I will try in 15 to 20 minutes to give a quick overview of how we see things developing in this space, as well as some basic definitions and approaches that are evolving, since I think the adaptation side of the climate change discussion is not as well understood as a lot of the discussion around the transition to a net zero or low carbon future. So that future needs to be both resilient and adapted to climate change, or it will face many more challenges going forward. I'll try to share a few slides and not kind of march you through all of them, but also to kind of highlight a few key themes, three major ones. First, just describing the broad question and challenge of adaptation and creating some distinctions around it. Second, to explain how, practically speaking, there is an adaptation investment strategy that we think is something that needs to be pursued in scale. And then third, talking about how the impact of that strategy can be measured and giving some next steps as well. So I'll try to share my screen here with any luck. Let's see, and I hope you can see that. Yes. And sort of just quickly flip you through some of the detail here. So as I think Amanda and others have said, adaptation is a really important part of the climate action agenda. It's different than mitigation, which is typically defined as reducing greenhouse gas emissions or reducing the trajectory that we're on for the impact and risk that we're all beginning to see unfold around us. Adaptation really is adapting to the new changes that will occur in spite of the fact that we are trying very, very hard to keep things to a much lower level of change. So adaptation is a critical component of the Paris Agreement as well. And it really calls for us to say, look, even at 1.5 degrees of warming, there's dramatic changes that will occur. And we need to prepare ourselves and society, particularly the most vulnerable, against these kinds of questions. As others have said, the current estimates keep rising, but the current view is that it could cost up to $300 billion per year in developing countries by 2030 alone. That figure has been repeatedly analyzed and I think continues to escalate as we start to see unprecedented changes occur in the risk and impact that's already out in the environment that's now being accelerated by climate change. This is just a list of some of the impacts that happened in 2020. This is 2 years ago. There's absolutely direct impacts in increasing temperature and increasing humidity, changes in extreme weather events being the most obvious, but impact not just on humanitarian crises, but also on the real economy. And that's resulting in an accelerating amount of spending and the beginnings of movements towards more proactive investment around the impacts of climate change. So whether it's California wildfires leading to an increase in spending of over $500 million by the surviving California utility in 2019 to over $1 billion per year starting in 2020, or the near day zero crisis that Cape Town went through in 2018, and the total lack of water in Chennai that happened in 2019, there's just now an accelerating demand and need for spending on the real economy to deal with some of the risk and impact we're seeing from climate change. But the surprising thing is what was reported earlier, which is less than 5% of all investments that are tracked against climate change has been focused on resilience or adapting to climate change, and less than $500 million of that in the private sector. So this is a famous, what's called the spaghetti chart, where they track different types of capital flows into climate finance globally on a biannual basis. And the little red circle there is the tiny amount of identified adaptation investment. So this is 30 billion against 300 billion that they think is required annually to deal with climate change in developing countries alone by 2030. And it's less than $500 million that can be identified in the private sector. That's despite the fact that everyone thinks that climate change adaptation is becoming an increasingly critical area for focus. UN Secretary General in January called for it to be half of the investments that are made against climate change. The UK, which is hosting COP26 in just a few weeks, has also called for a massive race to resilience alongside the race to zero. Secretary Kerry made statements about trying to substantially increase the amount of investment against climate resilience and adaptation in January, and is continuing to push for this. Development finance institutions are also pushing for this, and the Gary Working Group that's been described earlier has also been a major actor trying to increase our amount of focus on how do we adapt to or build resilience to the affecting change of climate change. What do we really mean, though? Part of the problem with adaptation has been a very difficult future that we can't really well get our arms around and understand what the definition of what is an adaptation activity or company or project. And so one of the things that we've been working on at Lightsmith is creating a taxonomy or a definition of what is an adaptation company. And so one way we've described that through a peer-reviewed taxonomy that was released last year is a company that actually has technologies, products, and services that on the one hand either help to assess risk and impact being increased by climate change or to help to manage those risk and impact. Most of the people on the planet Earth don't call what they do adaptation anything or climate resilience anything, but they have products and services and solutions that can either help us to understand how the risk and impact that already exists is going to change or help us to manage those things. And that's what we describe as companies that actually do adaptation and climate resilience. At Lightsmith, we're focused on 6 areas of focus that have to do with this kind of set of technologies and products and services. Those include companies that have technologies to evaluate agriculture and the changes in food productivity, supply chain analytics that actually helps to manage different aspects of assets in motion in the face of increasing weather volatility, fundamental technologies, geospatial imagery and mapping, catastrophe risk modeling in the insurance risk reinsurance sector, as well as weather modeling, weather analytics, and then physical products and services around agriculture and water, which are going to be dramatically impacted by climate change. And these 6 areas come directly out of analysis done by the IPCC and Germanwatch and other climate scientists that actually identify these types of vulnerabilities. There are other areas like medical diagnostics and other aspects of the design of nature-based solutions or infrastructure that will also be affected by this. An example is a water harvesting company. This is one of the things that we invested in last year. This has a solar-powered hydro panel technology. It looks like a solar electricity panel, but instead of generating electricity from the air and sun, it generates pure drinking water. So 5 to 9 liters of drinking water per panel under almost any set of atmospheric conditions. And we think this is a potential solution, for example, to the identified increase in drought risk and drinking water stress that's being exacerbated in multiple geographies around the world from climate change. There are other examples like digital mapping and risk analytics companies that I'd be happy to talk about as well, that help us to model how natural disasters are occurring today and will continue to change going forward. And I think, unfortunately, we're beginning to see the trend line of increasing amounts of these events going forward. I also wanted to add a note saying that it's possible not only to identify concrete companies that exist already that have these technologies, products, and services, but also to begin to measure the impact of these companies on the adaptation and climate resilience problem itself. In the land of mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions or the problem side, the cause side of climate change, there is a common currency, which is tons of greenhouse gas emissions reduced or carbon dioxide equivalent reduced. In adaptation, since we're quite early in developing investment strategies, it's difficult to measure since no one's actually come up with a single unit for adaptation. This remains a challenge. So we've suggested that one approach to measuring it is to measure it against sustainable development goals in different parts of the climate change universe. So where different interventions can help to support better water access or better agricultural productivity or more resilient communities against storms or floods or fires, there are aspects of the existing sustainable development goals that can be used as reference points to actually look at how we're improving our society's resilience and adaptation to climate change. I also wanted to note that there's very substantial differential impacts from the effects of climate change on women. So one of the things we're doing is tracking 3 to 5 indicators per company we invest in, and also mapping them not just against the sustainable development goals, but also against gender. Extreme weather events in some cases kill up to 5 times as many women and girls as men, unfortunately. Water stress, agricultural stress, healthcare stress is very differentiated in terms of its gender impact, and that set of problems will only increase because of the effect of climate change. So we should begin to look at climate resilience and adaptation through the lens of gender and also through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, I would leave you with just a few positive suggestions here. There are some new developments that are occurring just in 2021 alone. In the first 7 months of this year, over $16 billion of capital was raised in the private sector. You see Hank Paulson here, who's trying to raise, I think, somewhere between $4 and $7 billion for climate change investments. Climate tech has become a big area of investment, and we're pleased to report that about 2 weeks ago, the Green Climate Fund's board announced up to $100 million commitment for private investment in climate resilience and adaptation. So I think overall, the 3 major points I wanted to leave you with were, first, that adaptation is distinct from climate mitigation. You need to live in a world where you do both the transition to net zero and low carbon solutions going forward. But those solutions need to be deployed in an environment that takes account of the fact that the climate is changing. That means that weather conditions, temperature conditions, secondary, tertiary effects of climate change absolutely have to be part of that solution. And that's a huge priority for the planet, and one that's being, unfortunately, woefully underinvested in. So that's the first point. It's a big problem getting bigger. That is a huge challenge and a huge opportunity at the same time. The second point that I hope I made here is that there are practical ways to actually approach the problem. Our strategy at Lightsmith is to focus on tools, to focus on data and analytics, and products and services that can actually help us to understand how climate change will occur going forward, and also to help to manage that risk and impact as it plays through the economy. There are a number of different examples and sectors we can talk about in that context, but there are real ways that we can begin to practically prepare ourselves as a society and as an economy against the future impact of climate change, and do that in a way that actually generates a return for investors. And the third point is that that challenge is beginning to be taken up. At least we see the beginnings of an accelerated amount of activity in the private sector towards climate change investments. And so for those folks in the audience out here, both on the public policy side, but on the investment side, and even in the student side, there's a future where we're going to absolutely need to mobilize, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of capital to begin to address some of the changes that lay ahead of us in the next several decades. I will just leave you with 3 final ideas about possible ways to think about adaptation and climate resilience going forward. And they are the following. First, we are at a really unique point in time in thinking about adaptation and about mitigation in the climate context. And that's because of the recovery from COVID. So COVID, I think in some ways was an interesting analogy to the effects of climate change. It was a global phenomenon. It affected different populations very differently. as we can talk about, but it happened also at the same time as climate change. Nothing stopped the effect of climate change just because we're also having a global crisis that made everything more fragile because of COVID. So early last year, what we were really concerned about was what we would describe it as the sort of double whammy problem, where you had, and we saw COVID impacting populations that were already vulnerable because of climate change, and then climate change impacting those populations again. So if you had already a set of issues and vulnerabilities because of environmental pollution and respiratory ailment, COVID was going to make you even more vulnerable to that sort of respiratory set of ailment. And then if you compounded the COVID impact with giant smoke from wildfires, and then forced people into confined spaces, those two things interacted to make outcomes and respiratory ailment in certain populations even worse than they would have been independently. And that problem will continue to accelerate, even in the aftermath of the recovery from COVID. The economic fragility that you see out there in the supply chain, in infrastructure, in developing countries and vulnerable populations will be further impacted by the risk and impact of climate change. Flooding, storms, fires, and knock-on effects of all of those things will even be more significant on populations that have already been impacted by climate change. So the flip side to that is, in addition to the double whammy problem, you have the potential that if we design the recovery from COVID more intelligently, we can build resilience and adaptation into the future. For building new infrastructure, new supply chains, new nature-oriented solutions, new sets of jobs programs going forward or employment strategies going forward, they can all be done in the context of actually building back better with resilience and adaptation as a design feature of how we're making those decisions. So point one, recovery from COVID creates a unique set of circumstances that we should think about. The second point is this is a real equity and justice problem. So I think just as COVID revealed haves and have-nots in a very stark way, the effects of climate change are being borne disproportionately by vulnerable populations and developing countries, just like all the other effects are. And you're seeing that now in an increasing rate, where you've had Hurricane Harvey victims that had been Katrina refugees, and then repeated impacts in developing countries where the most vulnerable are being impacted even worse. And so as we kind of think about the distribution of risk and impact out there, making sure that technologies that we invest in and the products and services that we support and the scaling of the response to climate adaptation and resilience and to the transition to net zero, I think there's a really critical challenge in making sure that's done in an equitable way, in a way that actually takes account of a more inclusive future, or one that's going to be more prone to conflict. And then finally, I am a technological optimist, so I don't want to leave you with a sense that climate change and the challenge of adaptation going forward is simply one we're trying to fend off a very dark future and engage in a systematic, slower surrender than we otherwise would have. There are technologies and products and services out there that can have a systemic or transformational impact on the future. And so Naoko Ishii and others, she's the former CEO of the Jeff, have challenged us to think about the adaptation and resilience side of the equation, not simply as incremental. Let's not just propose building the seawall 1 foot higher this year, or retreating 1 mile further from the coast, or leaving out one more percentage of our population in the face of increasing storms, fires, floods, other kinds of impacts from climate change. Let's try to think transformationally or systemically about the problem. Her analogy was, in the case of renewable energy and energy efficiency, the strategy around the energy transition wasn't simply to reduce the carbon footprint of fossil fuels by a few percentage per year. It was to shift to an entirely different architecture for the energy sector, one that has renewable feedstocks, sun, wind, water, to generate electricity and power for the entire economy. And also one which has a more distributed and more technologically adept future, instead of a monolithic grid structure, one that has the potential for more self-healing, for more localized activity, for more decentralization. And similarly, instead of just building the seawall a foot higher every year, maybe we can develop technologies and approaches where we incorporate natural capital like wetlands or mangroves to reduce the amount of impact of flooding or storms on our coastlines, or technologies like hydro panels that, instead of reducing the carbon intensity of desalination a few percentage a year, uses an entirely new technology to generate clean drinking water under any conditions anywhere in the world. So I think whoever determines those types of technologies and develops the investment strategies for the future has the opportunity to make a dramatic impact on society and the economy, and also generate amazing returns for investors. And if we marry those two trend lines together, you have a real potential future. I'm a little surprised at this point that my 5-year-old daughter has not yet interrupted this webinar. She typically does that around this time. But as one of the things I would say personally has made me involved in and dedicated to focusing investment in adaptation and climate resilience, it's the thought that 10 years from now, in the 2030s, she'll be about 15 years old. And I don't know much about what the future looks like in the recovery from COVID or the credit cycle or in politics, but I think that the world will certainly be different from a climate perspective. And so the question and the choice for all of us now is, did we make investments today and develop strategies and technologies and move forward and take action so that 10 years from now, if you're at this conference, you don't look back and think, geez, I really wish we had done a lot more, because the world's very, very different today than it was 10 years ago. So we have that opportunity today. It's a challenge. It's a huge problem against which very little is being done today, but there are practical ways to approach that problem. There are practical ways to measure the impact of that activity, both financially and from an impact perspective. There's real momentum beginning to develop in the private sector, hopefully also the public sector. We'll see in about 2 weeks at the Global Climate Talks. And I think there's ways to approach the solution to that in the recovery from this global pandemic in a way that generates more equitable outcomes and one where we can have a transformational or systemic impact rather than an incremental one about the future. So I think if it's okay, end my remarks there. I'm happy to answer questions or to turn it back to Amanda for additional comments or questions or over to the panel of experts that we have going forward. I hope that's okay.
That's great, Jay. No, thank you very much. And would have probably enjoyed an interruption from your 5-year-old. A great reminder of, why we're out there doing this and why it's important to be acting on climate change right now. Thank you so much for your remarks. I really appreciate some of your key points. I think around, COVID, just how it laid bare both the have and have nots, as well as just the stark consequences of, poor planning, poor infrastructure, just how climate change really impacts us, and the fact that it was a real double whammy. But also appreciate your optimism. Maybe there's a double whammy of opportunity as well in terms of innovation and investment. I've always admired Lightsmith, I think, for your very comprehensive approach to climate adaptation, particularly looking into the data and analytics. We've had already a couple of comments from our audience members around, if it doesn't get measured, it can't be managed, more paraphrasing there, but have certainly seen where that is very key in climate change writ large, but particularly for adaptation. Appreciate your optimism in the technologies. I think, certainly a necessity is the mother of invention, where you're seeing a lot of innovation coming up to address challenges that people are just getting hit in the face with. And so I share your optimism as well, but also am not naive to the challenges. So I want to thank you so much for really teeing up the day, and certainly invite you to stay on for the panel and answer some questions. I see some coming in, so if you're able to stick around, please do. And with that, we'll move over to the panel today. So turning to that, we've assembled, in addition to Jay, a group of experts that represent everything from a policy think tank, a former development bank professional who's now working to directly develop financial instruments to channel private institutional capital into climate adaptation solutions, and someone who represents the investment banking side, the banking finance side, looking for ways to more effectively and commercially fund climate adaptation projects. Just another reminder for you, please put any of your questions in the Q&A session, not in the chat, put them in the Q&A. And we will be looking at those as we go along and asking those at the end of the panel after the 3 speakers have gone. So with that, I'll turn. Our first panelist today is Bella Tonkanoji. She is the Associate Director of Climate Finance at the Climate Policy Initiative, which is an analysis and advisory nonprofit organization that works at the nexus of finance and policy for climate change. She leads the US-based team at CPI, developing strategy for and overseeing research and initiatives. Her work ranges across climate finance topic areas, including blended finance, cities, and financial sector alignment. Bella previously oversaw energy and environment investments in emerging markets at the US Department of Treasury and was a climate economist at the EPA and OECD. She holds an MBA from MIT Sloan, an MSc from Imperial College London, and a BA from the University of California, Berkeley. So with that, Bella, thank you for being here today, and I will turn it over to you to give us some of your remarks.
Great, thanks so much, Amanda, and thanks, Jay, for that awesome keynote presentation. I always learn so much listening to Jay, and today was no difference from that. Let me just check you can see my slides.
Yes.
Great. I just have 3 slides today. I actually had to change mine a little bit on the fly as Jay was talking, just so because he showed one of our slides, which I think is quite useful to think about. So CPI, one of the things we do is we produce this global landscape of climate finance, which is an accounting and assessment of all of the climate finance flowing globally. And we look at mitigation and adaptation. So that spaghetti chart that Jay showed very briefly, which showed that tiny little rectangle in the top right corner of adaptation finance, that was from CPI's organization or CPI's analysis. We actually, about 20 minutes ago, finished our global launch webinar for this year's edition of the Global Landscape of Climate Finance. So now we have some slightly updated numbers, but they still show that adaptation finance is a very small amount of total climate finance. So let me just give you that summary there. So in 2017, 2018, which are the numbers that Jay showed, we had a total of $574 billion tracked in climate finance globally. The vast majority, 93%, was mitigation, and $30 billion was adaptation, which is about 5%. The good news and bad news is that in 2019, 2020, which is the data we just released in the last hour, adaptation finance is growing. It actually grew by 50% since the last time, but 50% of a relatively small number is still a small number. So we've got now about $46 billion of adaptation investment that we've tracked, compared with $570 billion of mitigation finance. So adaptation finance is increasing. It's still not at this 50% level. And I think to show this next slide, those numbers are in some ways, although we've been making progress, they're nowhere near where we actually need to be. So whether it's 50% increase or 70% increase year on year, we actually need to be sort of in order, we need to be sort of 10 times or 5 to 10 times kind of where we are today. And what we really need then is more of this systemic transformation that Jay was talking about. So incremental increases year on year are only going to get us so far. We really need the systemic transformation, which requires, say, a whole of government, whole of world approach to adaptation and mitigation investment. But of course, we're talking adaptation today. So let me then just show you my third slide, which just talks about some strategies that taken together we think can be effective in getting us this step change that we need. We can't do one or two without the other. So the first is mainstreaming resilience into investment decision making. This means that in order to be able to do this, and what it means is really making sure that investors, when they're making their decisions, and when companies are making their investment decisions, they're actually taking into account the risks from climate change when they do that. It's not as easy as saying that. They need a few things to be able to do that. The first is access to climate data. In developing countries in particular, that continues to be a big challenge. I mean, many developing countries don't have effective hydromet services, or even if they have the data, it's not available. They may not have the kinds of flood risk mapping that we do in the US, and they might not have forward climate projections. all of these things you need to be able to assess your climate risks, both of your investments and your company overall. A corollary to that is once you know those climate risks, you have to disclose them. And so in most countries, there's still not a mandatory disclosure regime that requires all companies to disclose their climate risks. It's something many countries are working on, including our own, and many around the world, including in developing countries, are also working on this. But again, you need information in order to be able to mainstream resilience. And the last is just around capacity, making sure that financial institutions, both on the public and private side, actually know what these climate risks are, how it affects them, and are able to actually incorporate them. The second area of this strategy is on enabling environment, which is just a fancy way of saying, the policy and regulatory environment. So what we see is really needed is adequate policies and regulatory frameworks that allow for investment to flow, both in terms of the way a government does its planning and procurement, the market environment itself. In many developing countries in particular, which are very vulnerable to climate change, investing at all is challenging, never mind investing in climate risk. And so actually improving the market environment is quite important. And lastly, the institutional and stakeholder environment needs to be a focus. How can we really bring in the vast array of stakeholders that need to be involved in improving adaptation and accelerating investment. Finally, just to say that the third area of this is just innovate and deploy. So there are many different financial instruments that can be used to deploy investment in adaptation. These can be funds and facilities, they can be risk finance mechanisms like insurance, really those financial instruments that can be used to finance activities that both inform climate resilient activities, or they build physical resistance to climate change impacts, or they allow us to respond to risks like insurance where you can't act, where physical climate impacts cannot or have not been eliminated. So one of the things that we're doing at CPI is we run an incubator for climate finance innovation called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, where we've now incubated 55 financial instruments for climate action around the world, including a number for adaptation, such as the CRAFT strategy that Jay mentioned, as well as one that you'll hear about from Jonathan first today, I imagine. And all of these instruments that we've incubated have mobilized more than $2.5 billion. And so what we're trying to do with the lab is really make sure that we support the entrepreneurs who are really trying to develop the funds, the investment strategies, the bond approaches, the insurance products that can have impact in mobilizing investment and ultimately in reducing physical climate impacts for people around the world. So let me pause there and turn back over to you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Bella. Really appreciate your slides and changing on the fly. I saw that spaghetti chart come through, the famous CPI spaghetti chart, but that really draws attention to the need for climate adaptation finance, that there's really a big gap there. I put a link to the Climate Finance Lab in the chat, and I can put one to CPI as well. But really appreciate your remarks, Bill. I think, really drawing attention to the need for a comprehensive ecosystem to support all of this, as well as the support for these innovative instruments that do look at, sort of blending both finance and enabling environment assistance, as well as the private capital. And appreciate your comments on trying to get this mainstreamed. This shouldn't be fringe. Like it's that 85% of people are, affected right now. I would imagine it's probably more than that, really. And so, it isn't a fringe idea. It's something we're all facing right now. So really appreciate your remarks. And I see there's already some questions coming in, so be ready. But before we do that, we'll turn to our next panelist, who is Jonathan First. Jonathan currently works for GFA Climate and Infrastructure. He's the managing director. But prior to that, he spent 17 years in investment banking in London, Toronto, and Johannesburg, as well as 8 years in development finance, including with the Development Bank of South Africa. He's a lawyer by training. Since 2012, he's focused on climate-focused development finance and impact investing in sub-Saharan Africa. He established GFA in 2018 to provide advisory services to support and fund climate-focused infrastructure. While he was at the Development Bank of South Africa, he developed innovative structured finance solutions and sourced funding for large infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa. He led the DBSA's initiative to create a green bank, which culminated in the establishment of the GCF funded climate finance facility in 2018. He currently serves on two committees of South Africa's first Green Outcomes Fund and on the advisory committee of the Global Climate Innovation Lab. He was also part of the task team that set up the Impact Investment National Advisory Board in South Africa. And I know Jonathan through working with him on one of the instruments that he structured that is very innovative and looking to tap into this tremendous private capital that's out there for climate adaptation, called Climate Adaptation Notes. So hopefully we'll get to hear some of that either in his presentation or in the questions. But with that, I will hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and hello to everyone. So I've been asked to talk about financial instruments and their relevance or within the context of adaptation. I think the most important thing to understand is that financial instruments cannot be developed in isolation. They have to be very much aligned to what I call the pillars of impact investing. And I think the most important thing that certainly came out from Jay's presentation is that it has to relate to a pipeline, what we call the demand side. If you don't understand the pipeline of projects that you're funding, there is no point in putting together a financial instrument. So the pipeline is most important, and the pipeline will influence very much the structure and the sources of funding for that financial instrument. So that's on the one side. On the other side is what we call the impact side. And that's very much be able to report, as we say, evaluate, and monitor the impacts from that investment. That is very much required by funders today. It's not a case of the projected impacts, it's the fact the impacts have to be achieved. So those are sort of the two pillars of impact investing, which very much influence the development of financial instruments. And then, of course, there's a supply side, which is the financial instrument itself, and of course, the sources of funding. And we need to appreciate as well is that, we saw that spaghetti graph of climate flows, but climate flows are delivered by way of an instrument. And certainly craft and CAN, which I'm going to talk to in a bit more detail, those are the instruments that deliver the funding. So we need to understand it as well. There needs to be a structure. The structure has to be appropriate, and the structure needs to be able to be contextualized in terms of the sources of funding. So I very much work on something called the funding spectrum. And what it is, it's to understand where the project or the program sits. So on the one extreme is energy, on the other extreme is a completely social project. And that very much influences both the instrument and the sources of funding. So, we saw that slide, which is obviously a little bit upsetting, which shows that there's still a disproportionate amount of money going into mitigation as opposed to adaptation. And the reason for that is, and applying what I call my funding spectrum, is all around what I call identifiable, reliable cash flows from projects. Because after all, it's the cash flows that repay debt. Whether the debt be concessional, whether it be long-term, short-term debt, it has to be repaid. And so to understand the cash flows from the project enables you to understand the instrument and also the sources of funding. So clearly mitigation is the easiest form of infrastructure to fund. And of course, adaptation is less so. And that is one of the main reasons why we're not seeing the flows of funding to adaptation-related projects, is the cash flows are far less certain, far less reliable than, for example, an energy or an energy efficiency related project. Now, having understood where the project fits in the sort of funding spectrum, we can then say, right, how much grant funding do we need and what should the grant funding be used for? How much concessional funding do we need and what should it be used for? And then lastly, how much private sector funding do we need and how can it be used? I think there's a couple of principles in terms of the development of financial instruments that I apply. Number one, we cannot rely on grant funding. So for me, grant funding is best used for what I call technical feasibility, but not to build into long-term funding structures. The second thing is that concessional funding must be seen as a credit enhancement. Its main role, and I believe its only role, should be to catalyze long-term or private sector funding. And that's very much, so I bear that in mind in putting together the funding structure. So those are the sort of three principles. And then the other one I feel very strongly about is to use local debt capital markets. In every market, whether it be, I even take Zimbabwe as the sort of extreme example. There's the equivalent of $5 billion in the pension funds, in the life companies. And none of that at the moment is applied to infrastructure in that country. So every country, no matter how many issues it has at the moment, we're not using local debt capital markets to fund projects. So having said all of that, this was very much the blueprint for climate adaptation notes. What we said is we needed an instrument which is targeted towards adaptation, which recognizes a couple of things. One, we need the grant funding to develop the platform. And I'll go into that in a little more detail. We need concessional funding to credit enhance or to catalyze the longer-term institutional investor funding. And we need the bank funding to deal with construction risk. Because a lot of the institutional investors, in fact, most of the institutional investors do not like construction risk. They want the project built on time, built according to specification, and then they'll invest. Whereas the banks, on the other hand, are becoming far more expensive in terms of Basel III to lend long-term. So the whole basis of CAN, or climate adaptation notes, is to get the banks to provide construction finance to take projects to what we call COD, to completion, and then to refinance the banks using the long-term institutional investor money, but all within a local debt capital markets context. And then, of course, we understood, or we tried to understand the pipeline behind CAN, and that very much influenced the structure of CAN. What we did in terms of credit enhancement or the use of concessional funding is we created two types of notes. The senior notes, so this is in terms of the long-term financing, the refinancing. The senior notes, which obviously would be subscribed for by the private sector, institutional investors, and then subordinated notes, which would be taken up by the DFIs. And those notes, as described, would be subordinated in terms of what we call the cash flow waterfall from the projects to the senior notes. So I hope that through CAN and through the description of CAN, I very much sort of met the principles that are outlined in terms of the development of a financial instrument in the context of what I called the funding spectrum. Thanks very much, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's always good to hear from the people who are actually working in the markets who've done this before in terms of structuring these instruments, and so firsthand what needs to be done, how it needs to be structured. It's been an honor to work with you on climate adaptation notes and think that it's really a strong potential solution for moving those billions of dollars that we keep talking about. But you raised the right point that you have to really understand that instrument, where are those cash flows coming from, where are they going to, all the sources and uses for us MBA folks out there, and that there is an opportunity for a strategic use of grants and other types of concessional capital or blended finance to help bridge some of those gaps, but they certainly shouldn't be the long-term solution for it. So thank you for that perspective, and look forward to some questions and discussion on that. But before we turn to that, I want to introduce our last panelist, who is Paul Rant. He is a vice president at Citigroup. At Citigroup, he helped launch and build their sustainability and corporate transitions group within the investment bank. This new team is part of Citigroup's strategy to support the transition to low carbon and sustainable business models. Previously, he focused on emerging market debt sustainability and capital markets development as part of Citigroup's public sector team. And prior to joining Citigroup, he was a direct investor in frontier markets based out of Hong Kong. So with that, Paul, we're really looking forward to perspective from Citi and understanding where you guys are going. So I'll turn it over to you for your remarks.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Jonathan and Bella are hard act to follow. So I'm going to try and take the perspective of a globally systemic bank, which is to say a larger financial institution trying to think about these problems and the solutions at a systemic or at a system-wide level. And as Bella and Jonathan both pointed out, that's really what's required if we're going to rise to the challenge that we face as it comes to adaptation finance. So I'm going to talk about four things. So very quickly, I don't have any slides, but I'm going to focus first on why does Citi, and this is Citigroup or Citibank as some may know it, why do we care about adaptation finance? Second, I'm going to address what the role of a bank like Citi is in addressing adaptation finance. Third, the challenges, and fourth, reasons to be positive. And that this, we can end on a positive note here before we take questions. So to begin, Citi cares about this because, as a large banking institution, we benefit and we grow when markets are growing and markets are stable. And a failure to adapt, a failure to be resilient, threatens both growth and stability in financial markets around the world. In some ways, unfortunately, we're becoming less resilient. So if we control for GDP growth, natural catastrophe and kind of failure to adapt losses have increased 1.6% year on year from 1970 to 2020. So over a 50-year period. And so when I say we're controlling for GDP growth, that means that we're actually, per every dollar of growth, we're actually seeing more damage every year. And this results from kind of two changes. One is the obvious climatic changes and the increase in storms and wildfires that we're all very familiar with, flooding. The other change that we're seeing is that as cities and as countries develop, they're increasingly growing extensively and growing into regions that maybe maybe are less safe or kind of less suitable for further urban development. And so we're hitting this interface with nature in a way that we didn't necessarily before. The other big problem is that we remain underinsured. So in 2020, if we just take the most recent year for which there's good data, there was $190 billion of economic loss resulting from natural disasters, and that does include earthquakes, but as well as more adaptation or climate change related disasters. 100 billion of that, so more than 50%, was not insured. And we know that the insurance gap is much larger in emerging markets than it is in developed markets or in the US or Europe. And I think one of the things that people don't always appreciate is that a lot of public infrastructure in emerging markets is not insured. So it's just very difficult, both it's a political matter and a financial matter for a politician in an emerging market to spend the money for insurance against unlikely or uncertain future events. And so they don't insure. Now, when therefore a catastrophe happens and a road is destroyed or a hospital is destroyed or other public infrastructure is destroyed, there is GDP growth in the form of rebuilding. So it looks like the economy is growing, but since that capital has been destroyed in the first instance, I don't know that we can really think about it in terms of growth. Really, it's replacement capital. And in the meantime, there's a drag on the economy because that road isn't there, that hospital isn't there, and people in growth are suffering. Of course, we know that COVID has exacerbated these risks both at the individual and at the national level. So on an individual level, we know that the human and personal losses, the job losses that were incurred have made individuals and families more financially fragile. So they are less able to kind of self-insure, which is to say, keep cash in an account against a rainy day. We also know that at the national level, frontier markets, just by way of, all markets have taken out extraordinary debt, but if we concentrate on frontier markets for a second, debt to GDP ratios in frontier markets have reached 110% of GDP, which is a record level. And the majority of that, now 60+%, is concentrated in general government debt. And so that means that public sector has less capacity than it did before to borrow and to self-insure at the national level as it might have done previously. Now, we can debate the appropriate levels of debt that countries take out, but I think it's just fair to say that counting on the public sector alone to be able to self-insure countries and to be able to invest in adaptation finance is, perhaps less possible than it was before. Thus, the need for the structured finance and that Jonathan was talking about in the CAN, and importantly, using that the relatively scarcer public capital in the form of grant money, et cetera, in very sensible ways that leverage the private financial participation. So what is the role of a bank like Citigroup, or Citi, as it's now known, in this challenge? And really what we do is we scale solutions. When we find something that we can replicate easily for the demand side that Jonathan was talking about, and be able to sell that to investors on the supply side, that's where a bank like Citi is really playing. And so we're looking always for scalable solutions to any set of challenges, but particularly to adaptation finance these days, because we realize the systemic importance to so many of the markets in which we work. Just for context, Citi has offices in 100 countries around the world, and we have business activities in 160 countries around the world. So you can imagine, you can see, or you get a sense for how, if we do not invest appropriately in adaptation finance, there are business impacts to us as a bank. So those who have been looking at infrastructure finance, climate finance generally, and adaptation finance specifically for a long time, with a particular focus on emerging markets, I think we'll be familiar with the challenges to scaling these solutions. And there's really two types of challenges as I think about it. And the first are familiar challenges, because they're familiar to all of those who were thinking about infrastructure finance 30, 20 years ago, when I think that was a kind of primary focus for investors. And the second set are kind of additional challenges that confront adaptation finance specifically. So if we think about those familiar infrastructure investing challenges in emerging markets, we think about things like currency risk, contract security, political risk, public-private partner structure and complexity. It isn't easy for international investors and international banks necessarily to cooperate with emerging market sponsors for emerging market adaptation finance. And then finally, refinancing risk. So when the banks do go to sell any lending that we've made to a project, are we able to sell it? Are we able to sell it at rates that we're comfortable with? And do we know that in advance of lending in the first instance? That's a big challenge before we take on that risk. So those challenges have been around, and I think we know them very well. That doesn't mean that they're any less true. Unfortunately, we don't really have great solutions yet at scale to managing those challenges, but there are really exciting developments. There are really innovative people and innovative solutions trying to address some of those challenges. The obstacles to scaling that are more specific to adaptation finance include, in no particular order, the context specificity. So what is adaptation in one location may not be adaptation in another. The solutions change, and the solutions have to be very tailored, I think to a greater degree than, say, building a road or building an airport. That makes it difficult to replicate products and replicate solutions very quickly. And again, as we as a very large bank are thinking about scaling, that's something we're looking for. And that's also something that the large investors, the large supplies of capital are looking for as well. They don't want to have to go through the same degree of diligence every time they want to invest. And so the extent to which things can be replicated reduces their burden for them to invest. Second, a lot of adaptation finance solutions are behavior-based. It is about where we choose to live, where we choose to build, and how we choose to live and build. And I think those solutions are difficult for banks or for the financial sector to influence unless we can somehow differentially price or provide incentives or penalties for bad behavior and good behavior, respectively. Otherwise, it's very difficult for the financial sector to influence behavior. That's really, for the most part, the role of regulation. And thirdly, as Jonathan talked about, there's a cash flow issue. It's a little bit easier to imagine and understand where the cash flows come from when we talk about mitigation finance or kind of general infrastructure investing than when we talk about resilience or adaptation finance specifically, simply because mostly what we're doing in terms of creating value is avoiding future loss. And avoiding loss doesn't always or doesn't obviously generate a cash flow that we can bank on. So all this is to say, those are the challenges, and I spent some time there. But I think there are reasons to be positive. And I want to caution here, I think I probably come across sounding very incrementalist versus Bella and Jay, who I think had the necessary corrective to me to say that this has to be really ambitious change and this can't be incremental change. I would say I completely agree with that, but kind of temperamentally, I'm an incrementalist guy. So if you'll pardon me there, I also work at a fairly incrementalist institution in some respects. So if you'll pardon me for that, I will say, I do think there are reasons to be positive, and these do tend to be incremental improvements. So some of them are just the scaling of solutions that already exist. Here, I would like to focus for a second on catastrophe bonds. So many people may actually already be well aware of catastrophe bonds. They've been widely sold in the market for at least 20 years, if not longer. But despite their kind of longevity in the market, in 2020, $16 billion of cat bonds were sold, which, given the scale of infrastructure that may need to be protected, and even the scale of infrastructure, the scale of economic losses that were realized in 2020, again, that's that 190 billion number, 16 billion of catastrophe bonds is not very much. And so the way a catastrophe bond works is that investors put capital into a trust that would be triggered in the event of a specific event. So imagine a hurricane of a certain magnitude hitting Mexico City, for example. Now, if that event happens within the time frame of the instrument, that pool of capital sitting in trust will flow relatively rapidly to the sponsor, in this case, say the Mexican or the city government of Mexico City, and allow them to begin the recovery efforts more quickly than they would do if they had to rely on traditional insurance. This instrument has multiple benefits. The first benefit is that it is a faster payout, and there's a lot of evidence to show that the sooner that you begin recovery, the more powerful the recovery is after a natural catastrophe, after an event. The other important characteristic of them is that they're supplemental to insurance. So as countries insure to a certain degree, insurance becomes very expensive, and this is a catastrophe bonds, cat bonds, or the leveraging of a different pool of capital, in this case, just investor capital, to again self-insure against that event. So we know that a number of countries issue these bonds, but again, it's primarily concentrated in the US, Japan, Mexico, a few others, and it hasn't been widely adopted. There was some progress recently as Jamaica, very hurricane-prone territory. They issued a cat bond with the support of the World Bank. I thought that was a very interesting and kind of powerful demonstration of the blended finance that Jonathan and Amanda were talking about. We've also seen corporates begin to adopt it. So typically, cat bonds are issued by reinsurers, like Swiss Re or Zurich Re. But recently, we saw Google issue a cat bond because they realized that they have a very large, difficult to insure footprint in California. And so by issuing a cat bond, they're able to supplement their insurance. So this is maybe not the most exciting or innovative form of adaptation finance at this point in time, but I do think it's very important. And I would like to see more investors getting involved in that space. It remains a very narrow, very specific pool of investors who have specialized risk analysis capabilities. And we would love to see more corporates, more governments getting involved in issuing these instruments because we do think that they serve a purpose. Beyond that, and I'm going to wrap up here just in the interest of time, but happy to talk more over questions. I think in addition to the really exciting technologies that Jay mentioned in particular, there's also really wonderful tech adjacencies and unexpected benefits from technologies that I think we're going to see more of as people become more thoughtful about particularly the behavior side of adaptation finance. And so I'm going to give a little anecdote, and I don't mean to be flippant here. This is a serious anecdote, but also a bit humorous. I used to live in Central Asia, and it was in Kazakhstan, and kind of widely used dating apps in Kazakhstan would tell people where they were relative to each other. how far away you are from the person that you might want to date, for the person you might want to ask on a date. But in Kazakhstan, that became used to alert people to natural catastrophe dangers as they happened and as they were experienced, because you could tell how far people were away from you. So you could alert people to an event that was happening nearby and say, don't do X, Y, or Z because such and such is happening, or such and such a building has become compromised, or something along these lines. And I thought that was a number of years ago that I experienced that, but it was such a wonderful demonstration of how people use the tools they have available to them. And if we think critically about these tech adjacencies, I think there are a lot of solutions out there, and we're going to see more and more that would be really wonderful and exciting to scale. So I'll stop there, and I hope that was interesting. Back to you, Amanda.
Well, thanks so much. That was fantastic, and really appreciate the. I think it's good to have both views of, here's the global scale, it's this, worldwide issue that we have to address, but we also have to come up with the solutions. And so that incrementalism is actually what is necessary when you come to, actually solving the problem. So no, it was very, very interesting to hear. I love the idea on cat bonds. I've done a lot of looking into those as well, and agree that there's a lot of potential opportunity there. So we're now going to go into the Q&A part of the session. As a reminder to the attendees, please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. We've had a number of questions in there, and our panelists have been starting to answer them as well in the Q&A, in the chat, or in the Q&A back and forth there. So, so take a look there if you see your question may already be answered, but I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Panelists, if you want to turn your cameras on, we can go ahead and do that. Okay, great. So I've been going through a number of the questions. I'll do my best to paraphrasing a few of the key themes that I'm seeing there. And I'll start by calling on one of the panelists to get the questions flowing, but I would ask you panelists, maybe just use the raise your hand function if you also want to respond to the question, and then I can call on you so we don't have sort of a free for all there. So starting with that, and Mackenzie's helping me monitor the questions as well. So as they come in, we'll try and get to as many as we can there. So starting with that, I think one of the key threads we saw throughout both Jay's address as well as the panelist remarks is the importance of data, and the importance of sort of like figuring out how to quantify things, understanding risk, understanding, I think, Paul, you mentioned behavior and how that's one of the harder things to fund as, an investment bank, or I think any kind of private investor, but then also the opportunity with cat bonds. We had a question in this section around what could the SEC do, sort of similar to like ESG tracking, I think, for corporates and things like. So a rather broad question, and I'm going to start with you, Jay, so just a warning. What do you see in terms of data? Can you expand a little bit on its role, where it can be applied, and then what data should we be tracking, and who should be tracking it, and how? So sort of, it's a very broad question, but if you could expand a little bit on that, because I think it really is a major missing piece, sort of on the larger scale. So if you could start with that, and then panelists, if you have anything to say, just go ahead and put your hand up, virtual hand up, and I'll call on you after that. Go ahead, Jay.
Thanks. And I'll say maybe just three quick things on data. First, on data, the answer on data is there is both not enough data and there's plenty of data. The not enough data is things that both Paul and Bella and Jonathan talked about, which is there is not nearly the amount of resolution of information about certain kinds of risk and impact out there in developing countries as there is in London or New York or places with lots of expensive assets, because people pay a lot of money to figure out how and what's going to happen to those assets when bad things happen. So, insurance penetration is only 30% globally. So a whole bunch of assets have never really been analyzed for what would happen if a storm hits them, or a fire, or flood, or other things like that. So that is a problem. And the data that we have is forensic data, right? We're looking backwards 10, 20, 50 years to look at past performances, sort of think about how the future is going to look. And unfortunately, we're driving into an increasingly complicated environment by looking in the rearview mirror. And so we need to start looking forward and projecting that data for a new set of considerations going forward. That being said, it doesn't mean that we have no data. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of information about what the pathway is likely to be for different types of humidity and temperature changes, at least for different timescale analysis. And we have a lot of data about what happens, what's happening right now. That needs to be adjusted for timescale. It needs to be future looking as opposed to past looking. We can't like forensically analyze what's going to happen going forward. And it needs to be much more sophisticated and detailed in developing country and vulnerable population context than it is now. But it's not like we're starting from nowhere, right? We have insurance underwriting, we have credit risk analysis. That's how the real private sector actually measures the cost of everything. And we just need to update the inputs that are going into that. If we have a lot more storm risk, flood risk, fire risk, disruption risk, then that's just going to change the way we calculate how we charge insurance premia or what credit rating we're going to give to different projects. And if that was all updated, capital would flow and adjust just as it does when there's new information about political risk or changes in circumstances or the pandemic. So I think that's the first point, which is we do need certainly to address the data problem, but it's not like we're starting from zero. And my last coda on the data problem would be, let us not create the Esperanto problem, where we invent a whole new language that nobody wants to speak. We have plenty of languages we already speak. We just need to update how we're using them. The second point is data is not the answer or the problem either. It's what you do with the data, right? So academia, the government, everyone has a real basic need to generate more information, but it's only useful if it can be digested by people that make decisions. And whether that's individuals or communities or governments or companies, we all take that data in every day and we take it in a form that actually is usable by us right now. So if we can update the data that we're already using in a way that we can actually digest it and use it, that is the highest probability chance of success here. Again, if we create a whole new set of data that nobody understands, like trying to explain climate models to a normal human is like making their head explode multiple times. It's not going to work. But if we can update, data to help governments make decisions about infrastructure, or communities make decisions about where they want their population centers to be, or individuals to make sense of how they make investments in their pension funds or their own assets, or whether they live in a place or move to another place or support different policies, that is the data that can actually be useful and move forward in time. And the last piece here is we can what I would take is the MacGyver approach, because I'm a child of the 1980s and 90s, which is take the data that's laying around right now and apply it to try to solve the problem that's in front of us right now. So if we take underwriting of catastrophes from the ILS space, the insurance-linked securities and reinsurance space, that is the best modeling we have for what happens with hurricanes or tropical cyclones or giant wildfires, enormous floods, and apply it outside of the insurance context to real estate or to infrastructure investments or to credit underwriting or the kind of projects that Jonathan's talking about. So we actually take this incredibly sophisticated modeling, which is typically like only 1 year forward modeling, and make it for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, and put it in a way that's digestible for people trying to design, road projects or solar projects. Then we can take that stuff that's lying around, the duct tape and paper clips lying around, and try to solve the problems that we have right now. And I think that's the best chance for it. We think that's an enormous opportunity for investment. We are focused actively at Lightsmith on companies that have analytics around agriculture today, around supply chain analytics today, around digital mapping and geospatial imagery today, around catastrophe risk modeling, weather analytics today, because we think all of those places and companies and tools and technologies will be vastly more valuable going forward as everything becomes more complicated, and you want them to be vastly more valuable going forward. 5 or 10 years from now, we will want billion-dollar sized companies that can help us understand what the path of risk is likely to be in water and agriculture and the supply chain and where we live, in the energy system, financial services system, the credit system, and so on. So those are all the things that I think I would say about data, which is there is enough and there's also not enough, but it's really how do we make it useful? How do we scale it? And that's a path forward for innovation and investment.
Thanks, Jay. No, as a child of the 80s and 90s myself, I appreciate the MacGyver reference. That's always never bad to reference MacGyver. And especially I think, using what we already have is an important thing, because I think lots of people trip all over themselves to come up with something new and great, but really there's probably enough out there to work with. Jonathan and Paul, you both had your hands up. I saw Jonathan's first, so I will give it over to Jonathan and then Paul for your comments about data.
The comment I wanted to make about impact reporting is that we have to be realistic and commercial. So there are two themes in the emerging markets that are important. The one is infrastructure, and the other is SMEs. So you cannot impose on an SME reporting requirements as a condition to the funding if they cannot, first of all, understand what you're requiring, or they have to hire a team of 10 people to do the sort of dig out the information. So we really need to contextualize reporting. And the other thing that I found out as well, and I'm very much looking at it at the moment, is there's a lot of platforms to report, but the platforms are not appropriate to getting the information from the recipients of the funding. And also within that context, the borrower, let's call it the borrower, the recipient of the investment, must also see the benefit within their own businesses or within their own projects. So it's not only the benefit for the investor wanting to do sustainability reports to their shareholders and board and everyone else, but the company itself or the SME or the project must understand the benefits and we use those benefits, those reporting benefits to improve their businesses. So I cannot stress that enough. You need to see this within the context of the developing or the emerging markets and within their capacity to report on impact. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that's really important also to keep in mind that, keep things simple, make it, I think we have talked in the past about, keep things simple and robust is sort of the challenge. It should be meaningful, but not, overly burdensome that you have to create a whole impact reporting department. Paul, over to you for your comments, please.
Thank you, Amanda. And building upon what Jay said, and actually part of Bella's comments as well, I think where we do have a lot of data, but it isn't. I guess one of the challenges we have is we have a lot of data that people do not have access to, and so to amend the comment you made earlier that you can't manage what you don't measure, what I think a lot of financial institutions are now discovering, and what I think what regulators have discovered is that we won't manage what we haven't disclosed to our stakeholders. And that's not malicious or anything, but it is about investment of time and resources. And when there's an expectation that we report, we do report. And I think when we are reporting things, we feel pressure and behavior does change. And that's really been the thrust of so much emerging regulation, first in Europe, but certainly not limited to Europe. The US is considering similar regulation, Brazil, China, other emerging markets. But I am very respectful of Jonathan's comment and your comment, Amanda, that these have to be applied in contextually sensitive manners, and that the expectation for a large, S&P 500 company in terms of its reporting and climate disclosure, resilience disclosure has to be appropriate versus what we can expect from SMEs. And I actually think, not to throw my own institution under the bus, but large financial institutions are actually maybe a good place to aggregate some of that data because we do have capacity.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, no, I think all really good points. And I always appreciate you throwing your own institution under a bus. That's, great. But I think so sort of along the, you talk about speaking of a large institution, one of the couple of questions from the audience had to do with scale and noting that, climate adaptation is ultimately a very local problem. You're impacted right there. You don't have water, you have too much water, all those things. And so the solutions are tremendously local. And in that case can also be very small scale. Yet we're talking about billions of dollars, as the gap for financing. And so you've got a real mismatch there between sort of, ticket size for a city or, just the transaction cost to aggregate all of that, can be a real challenge besides some of the other risks that we've talked about. And Bella, I'm going to come to you on this. So heads up to start with. This issue of scale, I think at the lab and in some of the reporting that that CPI has done, you look a lot at innovative financial models and different approaches for how to engage and to some extent look at this problem of this real local problem with a global solution, to sort of paraphrase yet another cliched kind of phrase, but what are you seeing that is out there that may be working? Are there instruments that you're seeing or approaches that you're seeing that address this scale? Or if you just sort of want to expand on even what the challenge is, if there isn't necessarily a solution, but just wanted to get your view on that, because a couple of audience members really kind of commented on that. So what can we do there? And again, reminder, panelists, raise your hand if you want to also make a comment after Bella. Go ahead, Bella.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, Amanda. And I think two things come to mind. One is the importance of intermediaries. So in particular, when you're thinking about all of these smaller investment opportunities, investing in SMEs, maybe investing in local infrastructure projects, a big institutional investor, a pension fund, is not going to be able to do the due diligence on each one of those. It costs them the same to assess a $1 million investment as it does a $100 million investment. So they go for the $100 million investments. So you need the intermediaries. I think that's where the lab is trying to really support those intermediaries, the people who can actually, the entrepreneurs, the fund managers who can actually operate between the demand for investment, the smaller projects, the SMEs, the infrastructure, and the supply of investment, the big pension funds, commercial banks to an extent. And so we really have been trying to support the fund managers actually getting their ideas off the ground. And it can be fund managers, sometimes it's local financial institutions as well. I think, there was a question in the chat about, how do you, what are some of the things that you can do, say, in Africa? There are many local financial institutions that need their capacity built so that they can invest more in the resilience of their clients and investees and really help them actually address their climate impacts. But you have to work with those intermediaries. You're not going to be able to do it on this at this big global scale, and nor should you, right? I mean, I think that's one thing that's, adaptation is this local problem. It's actually because of that. It's actually in some ways can be even more easily investable than mitigation. You're solving local issues. You can bring in local communities and really make sure that you are addressing what they're really, the problems that they're really seeing in their communities. I think just the second thing on scale was the point I made in my slides, which was around mainstreaming. It's really mainstreaming climate investment and decision making. I think we will keep working with fund managers, with intermediaries. I think if we're really going to scale up investment in climate resilience, it needs to be something that every financial institution, every intermediary is looking at when they are making their investment decisions. So that is something we need to keep building capacity on and really providing the tools for them to do that, whether that be through mandatory climate risk disclosures or access to data and climate related services.
Thanks, Bella. Any of the other panelists want to? I don't see any hands up on that one. So I will just thank you for that, Bella. I think that's some really, it's one of the biggest challenges that we're constantly seeing. So really appreciate it. I think certainly we've seen a lot of intermediaries who are coming, trying to sort of solve that puzzle there in terms of being able to aggregate some of the scale and that sort of thing. So really a lot of opportunity there. So I wanted to turn to you, Paul. We've gotten a couple of questions around city, and we've gotten some questions around regulations and stuff. So just kind of a two-part question, and then I think it's broad enough that the rest of the panelists could also chime in if they'd like to. But what are the developments in the financial banking sector that you think are sort of most important? And then sort of adding on to that, you mentioned, in terms of behavior, and think that regulation is the area. Regulation can also play a part in terms of behavior and stuff like that. So where do you see sort of a group like Citi being able to come in and make a difference? And then where do you see regulation being maybe helpful in, incentivizing new behaviors or incentivizing investors to go into other spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'll try and keep both parts of that question in mind. I think with regards to where I see really promising developments in the financial sector, and where banks, Citi and our peer institutions are all active, are in the bond markets in particular. I think there's been a lot of innovation in the bond market, and some of it might seem a little uninspiring in the first instance, but I think people should not underestimate the importance of the change that's happening. And so I refer here specifically to something like the green bond market. Now, the way a green bond, now we also have social and sustainability bonds. These are use of proceeds instruments, which is to say, I go out, I'm a big corporate, I go out, I issue a bond for $500 million, and I tell my investors up front, this $500 million is going to be spent on green capital expenditures. It's, I'm going to be investing as a corporate in renewable sourcing, in switching my fleet over to EVs, or investing in my workforce during the pandemic, for an example of a social expenditure. And I've committed to doing that, and I will report on that every year until all of the money is allocated. Now, companies should be doing this anyway. Why do we need this special instrument? Well, again, because once they're putting it out there in the market and they're giving it to their stakeholders, their investors and their regulators and their banks and everyone else, there's a greater degree of commitment made, right? Because we'll hold, somebody is going to hold them to account, or at least that's the theory. This market for green social sustainability bonds has exploded in the last 10 years. Even in the last 5 years, it's grown at a CAGR, compound annual growth rate of almost 40%. And we're probably going to reach almost $1 trillion of issuance in 2021 alone. So now how do we think about this in terms of adaptation? There have been a few resilience bonds kind of contemplated and issued. And the idea there is that, again, it would be a use of proceeds instrument where we're going to say, some portion of that bond that I've raised, I'm going to dedicate to adaptation finance for my company, for my community, etc. Now, the trick has been, I think, why that hasn't been a bigger subsector of this space so far is, again, this uncertainty about what resilience really means. Do we have the data to understand what's a worthwhile investment for corporate to make in adaptation finance? Do we understand the benefits that will accrue to the company from that investment in adaptation finance? And I think here, to bring in another theme of the conversation, it's the data piece. And so I think we see more insurers becoming engaged in this discussion. And insurers are a population in the financial sector that have data about what makes a difference. And so insurers can tell you, if you cut trees back a certain number of meters from your electrical wire, what is the kind of lower percentage risk that you'll have of starting a fire? And so if we can integrate that type of data into these types of instruments, we can really value the incremental benefits that are coming from those corporate investments. So, I think that probably comes off as sounding really dry and kind of very much like, oh, but these things are already out there and the differences aren't being seen. But I will say, we have the privilege of talking to some of the world's and some of America's, biggest corporate companies every day. And the pace of change of thinking among, the finance divisions of these companies is really extraordinary. And so, the finance function in all of these large corporates is suddenly able to talk about climate and adaptation in a very sophisticated manner. And that's really inspiring to see. And so, yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Jay, you had your hand up. Maybe do a quick comment there, and then we'll go to a final question before we head to the networking.
Yeah, just quickly, I think what Paul's saying is absolutely right. And $1 trillion of green bond affirmative issuance is great in the context of 13 trillion of fixed income issuance annually. It's like less than a month's worth of activity. And you got to wonder what the other 12 trillion is doing, if it's playing offense or defense in this kind of context. But it's a huge transition. I would say two things are really important to think about. One is, I think that the affirmative use of proceeds to support adaptation is one thing, but simply understanding whether your investments have considered the question of climate change is going to be critical table stakes. We don't have like AML KYC bonds and non-AML KYC bonds. We have everything that actually has to look at whether you're doing money laundering or doing terrorism or supporting child labor or dumping effluent in the river. I mean, you don't have a distinction between those two things. And I think you're going to end up having a category of issuance where people have actually considered whether everything's been lit on fire or not, and people that haven't. And it wouldn't be resilient or non-resilient. It would be realistic or not realistic. So the poster child for this was PG&E, the 10th largest utility in the United States, going bankrupt because of its liability for wildfire risk. And that's the first, not the last, of these kind of climate change bankruptcy, according to the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which is not the Guardian. So the point here is, unless you begin to account for these things systematically, not just on playing offense, but even simply understanding what's realistic, this will occur to your investments. And I think that at a minimum will start to happen. The other thing is, in terms of changing your own behavior, the one thing I would say is what everyone can push for is to understand what your own options are, right? So if you look at your 401k or personal pension plan, you have no idea how much carbon you're supporting or whether it's resilient or not, right? And it was really interesting, about a year or two ago, HSBC made the point that we should stop talking about 1.5 or 2 degree portfolio strategies as if there's some kind of extra nice to have thing. If you invested just in the FTSE index, the kind of standard generic index in London, you support a 3.9 degree outcome through your investments. So it's not that you have neutral investments and then climate friendly investments. You have climate devastating investments that you're doing right now and supporting, and ones that are less devastating, right? And so in the same way, is your investment portfolio one that's actually taken account of the fact that we're gonna have a lot more fire, flood, natural disaster disruption, or one that's just totally vulnerable to that? And I can tell you, as an individual investor, I look at my portfolio of assets and I think, geez, I have very little information about how much of this stuff has been thought of in both of these contexts. And I 100% believe in the potential outcome here. You know, the strange thing is that Donald Trump actually applied for protection of his golf course in Scotland against erosion because of climate change. So he's actually taking affirmative steps to protect his assets against the physical risk and impact of climate change. And I wonder how many of the rest of us have actually taken that step in the face of that kind of context. So until we have the option to choose that, we're all going naked along into a position where this risk is out there. And our portfolios are unfortunately supporting a lot of outcomes that I don't think we would agree with if we had the affirmative choice to do so. So demanding that choice and creating the opportunity to make that choice, I think, is something that's critical for institutional investors, but for individual investors as well. And I hope that the financial services sector can start moving that direction. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
That's a great point, Jay. You know, I think absolutely, I think about that a lot with my portfolio, and, you know, trying to just even, find a way in to understand what is there is hard enough. So that's a really important point. So thank you to the panel. We are running over time and we're going to switch the networking very quickly, but I wanted to do one quick lightning round, literally like a 10-word response from each of you. We've got COP26 coming up. You know, this is climate month. All these things are happening. We're doing a lot of talking, but what are the actions? What I'd like to hear from each of you in, like 10 words or less, just a quick lightning round is, what do you see as either put it in this context of COP26, the top priority outcomes there, or the top areas that, the private sector, investment banking capital, private capital, what have you, can be going into in the coming years to address climate adaptation. So I will start with, the order will be Jay, Paul, Bella, Jonathan. So very quick answers, go.
My quick answer is action, right? So climate adaptation investment is at the very beginning, and I think you're going to see announcements that start to actually make that a little bit more real and substantial. And then the second point is, I really hope that in this moment after COVID, decisions that usually take 20 or 30 years that are going to be compressed into the next 18 to 24 months, really take account of this. We have a real chance to make a difference, and we're going to lose that window very, very quickly and lose the credibility to make those decisions right now. So I hope some of those come out of it.
Thanks. Excellent. Paul, over to you.
I confess to being a little bit nervous. Pardon me. I confess to being a little bit nervous that the political side of COP26 is not going to live up to expectations. And so I'm really hoping that the private sector participants can apply the mutual pressure on each other to make this a race for the top in the private sector, and not rely on the public sector to push us forward.
Fantastic. Thanks. Bella.
So much to say. I think, let's see, mandatory risk disclosure, incorporating resilience in all government decisions, and more public climate finance, especially for developing countries.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So I'm going to wear my emerging markets hat, and I'm going to say that the industrial world has built their industrial bases on the back of polluting this climate. It's a fact. They need to start supporting the emerging markets. The emerging markets did not create this catastrophe, yet they're being asked to pull their weight. I think it's the other way around. I really believe that. And anything you read confirms that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. That's a really important point to end on. I'm sad we have to end because I think there's so much that could be here. I have 20 more questions I would like to ask, but thank you to the panel so much. This has been a great way to start this conference. Really important discussions, both the emerging markets, data, all kinds of key themes here. So really want to thank you. Mackenzie, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a little bit of information on how we're going to do this brief virtual networking session. And just a reminder, panelists, there are some questions in the Q&A. If you want to answer any of those just by typing, please feel free to do so. So thanks, everyone. Mackenzie, over to you for the networking.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all to all of our panelists today. We are grateful to all of our speakers for facilitating this important discussion. We will now move to the networking portion of the session, which is the last section of the event today. The networking session will feel free to stay off camera or turn on camera and use the chat box to send direct messages to attendees you would like to connect with. In your messages, you may include your name, contact information, and preferred timing, either to connect now or after the conference. We will not be able to talk live today, so we do ask that you connect offline, and we will work to share contact information for the attendees after the conference. You may save your direct messages by clicking the 3 dots next to your chat box and selecting Save Chat. And we will stay on a few extra minutes for those so that everyone has time to connect. If you're able to join us for the remaining days of the conference, you will also have time to connect with each other. So we will have no formal closing remarks after the networking session, but we will stay on a bit later and be in the chat box to help facilitate the discussion. Thank you and enjoy.